I'm Jenna Robinson, president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to higher education reform. We advocate responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, and cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market-based reform. For those of you who are new to the Martin Center, you can find our website at jamesgmartin.center. The Martin Center's education book discussions are quarterly online events with authors of recent or sort of recent books about higher education or related topics. Thank you to our viewers and donors for making events like this possible. Although this event is free, we appreciate those of you who made voluntary contributions. Your support fuels everything we do. Before we get started with today's talk, I wanted to tell you about another upcoming event. This one is in person in Raleigh, North Carolina. On June 12th, we're hosting a luncheon with my good friend and co-author, Stanley Kurtz of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Stanley will talk about restoring merit to higher education. We'll put the link to the event in the chat box. I'll hand the floor over to Erec shortly, but I wanted to take 1 minute to tell you all how this event will run. First, Erec will talk for about 20 minutes about his book. Then Erec and my colleague, George Leaf, will have a short discussion. At around 3:15, George will start posing questions from the audience. Viewers, you can post a question at any time by using the Q&A icon, and George will get to them at the end of the talk. And for viewers on Facebook, simply post your questions in the comments section, and we'll be sure to monitor those as well. Also, we are recording this event, so you can watch it later or share it online. And now I have to go back and say that I misspoke about the title of Stanley's talk. It is Rediscovering Western Civilization. And please check that out on our website. Again, thank you for being here and for supporting our work. We hope to see some of you in person next month. And now I'll turn to today's talk. The book we're talking about is A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition, The Semblance of Empowerment, which critiques current anti-racist ideology in rhetoric and composition, arguing that it inadvertently promotes a deficit model of empowerment for both students and scholars. And the author of that book is Erec Smith, an Associate Professor of Rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania, whose primary work focuses on the rhetorics of anti-racist activism, theory, and pedagogy. He is also the president of the Foundation for Free Black Thought, and he recently testified to Congress about DEI in higher education in an address to the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development. In addition to A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition, Smith has also published The Lure of Disempowerment, Reclaiming Agency in the Age of CRT. I'm excited to have Erec with us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's always good to be given the opportunity to talk about these ideas. And to explain myself, really, because when people see a Black man publicly stating that he's against diversity, equity, and inclusion, that causes a kind of cognitive dissonance that people don't seem to get over. They go from critical thinking to ad hominem attacks, basically calling me all kinds of names that have the general connotation of race traitor. But I need you to know that when I say diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is not being interpreted through a classical liberal lens. It's being seen through a lens of critical social justice. And with that ideology, diversity, equity, and inclusion are no longer those terms in the common understandings of those terms. There's something very different, something very illiberal. Diversity of thought is not included in diversity. Equity, having everybody be given the opportunities to use the available resources, that's not going on. It's more like equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. And inclusion is exclusion, really. There's certain things you can't say in order to have people feel included. And these things you can't say are as innocuous as, the most qualified person should get the job, or something like that. Microaggressions, if you will. So enough about that. I just wanted to explain to the audience that I am by no means against diversity, equity, inclusion, and the common definitions of those terms. I am very much against diversity, equity, and inclusion as a movement undergirded by critical social justice. And I'll go into what critical social justice is a little bit later on. If I remember, I'm here today to talk about my book that came out in 2020, I guess. Wow, it's been 4 years. A critique of anti-racism in rhetoric and composition, the semblance of empowerment. First, I'll tell you why I wrote this book, or what prompted it anyway, and then I'll get into some of my argument. In 2019, there was a keynote address at the biggest conference in my field, college composition and communication. And the speaker had the argument that it was inherently racist to teach or expect students of color to write in standard English, because they have their quote unquote home dialects, and therefore making writing instruction a form of oppression. I went on a now defunct listserv and kind of pushed back a little bit. I said, is this really a good idea? Maybe, possibly standard English can come in handy one of these days in the students' futures, right? As civic context, professional context. And the response really changed my outlook of my field, of social justice generally, right? And what it showed me was this embrace of illiberal attitudes that emphasize victimhood and prefigurative politics. And I'll explain what those things are momentarily. But I should have you know that after that incident, I was already writing a book for Lexington Press that I pretty much revamped, the next day, right? And I don't suggest doing that 3 months before the deadline. That's not good for anybody's psyche. But I felt like I had to do it. I was motivated by the responses I got, the ad hominem responses, the attempt to degrade or desecrate my image through spreading rumors, outright lies, things like that. I saw the infantilization of my field up close and personal that day. So that all prompted me to revamp my book into what we're talking about today, a critique of anti-racism in rhetoric and composition. Anti-racism, now, when I wrote this book, I did not say things like critical race theory or critical social justice, barely said anti-racism, right? Because although I was aware of those subfields, I wasn't steeped enough in them to focus my arguments around them. I didn't need them, really. And that's another point I want to make when it comes to this. I didn't need to critique critical race theory or critical social justice. I needed to expose what was going on in my field. And what was going on is what I call in the book a primacy of identity. Identity trumped everything. Critical thinking, it denied critical inquiry, right? People were prohibited from critiquing quote unquote sacred texts, works you could not critique because they were written by particular people, most often people of color, right? And there is a form of what's called prefiguration in my field. A lot of prefigurative politics. Now, prefigurative politics can be done right. The definition of prefigurative politics is the acting out of the world you want to see as you protest, as a form of activism. Occupy Wall Street was this, right? They're living the world they want to see as they're protesting the world that is, right? You're kind of seeing it now with some encampments on college campuses. But the difference between that, something like Occupy Wall Street and what was going on in my field, and I fear academia at large, is that the prefiguration was enough in itself. People were fine playing make-believe in their campuses or departments or something like that. And what they weren't doing, which the Occupy Wall Street people were trying to do, what they weren't doing was leaving that behind eventually and then going out into the world and then trying to make real material change. They were satisfied with creating this prefigurative bubble, their own world, be it an entire college campus, or a department or a school or something, or a conference or a field, right? The prefiguration was not strategic. It was an end in itself. And if you reminded people that the real world didn't work like this, then you were persona non grata. And I know that from personal experience. So what else is a part of the illiberal nature of a primacy of identity? Essentialism. Racial essentialism most prominently, but essentialism generally. And what I mean by essentialism is attributing a set of characteristics to a group based on that group's identity, be it skin color, be it sexual orientation, what have you. You're basically saying anybody of this group has to abide by these characteristics. And if they don't, they're not authentically a member of that group, right? Lately, I've been calling this prescriptive racism. And prescriptive racism is just that. You basically prescribe behavior onto people based on their identity. So as a Black person, a prescriptive racist would prescribe a dialect, interest, values, beliefs, behaviors, all these things onto me, and then call me inauthentic when I don't abide by them. And this is happening. This is a multicultural affair, which is to say that a prescriptive racist can be Black, can be white, all right? It can be anybody. Yes, people in my field, white people in my field are quite comfortable telling me how to be Black, right? Because of this prescriptive racism, this essentialism that is a part of what's going on. Why is it a part of what's going on? Because individuality is kryptonite to a lot of the contemporary DEI initiatives going on today. Everybody of a certain group has to basically be the same or else it doesn't work. Every Black person has to interpret a microaggression the same, right? Or else it doesn't work. If I say, well, I wasn't offended by that because in my experience, this, that, and the other thing, that disempowers the ideology, right? It weakens it a bit. It shows that these groups are full of individuals and not clones, right? They're not the Borg from Star Trek. They're a bunch of individual people with their own outlooks on life, right? So in order to maintain something like a contemporary DEI, you have to make the argument that the things you are prohibiting would be offensive to all minorities for the same reasons, which simply isn't true, right? And my organization, Free Black Thought, is out there to kind of push that idea. I can talk about that a little bit later on. But there is this essentialism along with a prefigurative politics, right? And sacred victimhood. All right, so let's talk about that for a second. Victimhood is kind of a virtue in contemporary diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Why? Because there has to be a victimized person, or else why are you pushing back on hegemony, right? There has to be somebody who's always already suffering, always already wronged, right? So that you can always already be fighting the powers that be. The last thing, a lot of critical social justice proponents, I won't say DEI proponents because they're not all abided by critical social justice. A lot of critical social justice proponents, they don't want to see racism go away. That's the last thing they want to see. It justifies their politics. It justifies their behaviors. It justifies the way they do things. So an us versus them attitude in which us, are the victims, right? And the oppressors are typically white, male, cis, or people with enough privileged intersections in their identity to be seen as hegemonic, right? And in order to maintain that us versus them attitude, you have to be a victim, which is also to say that you have to infantilize a lot of the people you claim to be helping, right? If we keep the status quo, then all these minorities will be wronged. They'll be hurt, and they really need our help because they're all victims. So in order to help these victims, we have to push back and change, transform society. Right? All this was happening in my field. I was seeing it firsthand, upfront and personal. And I was always seeing it. I was seeing it for a while, but I guess part of me didn't want to acknowledge what I was seeing. And the other part of me didn't actually realize how bad things were until I pushed back on the thesis of that keynote address I mentioned a little bit earlier on. So what can be done about all of this? In the book, I have a chapter which I extended into a subsequent book about empowerment theory. And what empowerment theory is a theory that involves three components: the intrapersonal, the interactional, and the behavioral. The intrapersonal is about self-awareness and self-management, emotional self-control, metacognition, interrogating yourself. Why do you believe the things you believe? Where do those ideas come from? The interactional is about how we interact with other people, being careful not to project preconceived notions onto those people, being able to listen actively and not just wait for the other person to stop talking so that we can talk, right? And then there's the behavioral component, which is basically how we work together as a team. Typically with what's called superordinate goals, goals that can't be accomplished by ourselves. We need to reach out and build partnerships with other people in order to acquire these goals, and those other people also have the same goals, right? I think taking seriously, at least, not really implementing empowerment theory as some kind of overarching methodology throughout the entire field or anything like that, but taking these ideas seriously, I think can go a long way towards moving on from the sacred victim to a person with agency and a sense of empowerment, true empowerment, not the semblance of empowerment. A lot of times we try to skip the intrapersonal. We go straight to the interactional. We go straight to how do we all get along here, right? When we don't ask, okay, what are my issues in the first place? Why do I have these beliefs? We don't really get to know ourselves, so that when we do get to these other people, we're projecting onto them, right? Some ideas that we already have, some preconceived notions. This was what's going on with essentialism, with prescriptive racism, right? You're projecting things onto other people. And a good way to kind of check yourself and be careful not to do that in the future is intrapersonal empowerment. Emotional and cognitive self-awareness, right, is a great way to go about doing that. Obviously, you have people who would be open to this empowerment theory, but you also have people who wouldn't be because the victim thing is imperative to the politics, right? As I said earlier with the sacred victim, you know, to be a protagonist in this narrative is to be a victim. You have to keep that going. So essentializing me as a victim is strategy for a particular kind of illiberal politics called critical social justice, which basically argues that Western civilization is set up for the express purpose of maintaining white supremacy, that there is always an oppressor versus oppressed dynamic, which is to say a white versus non-white dynamic if you're speaking racially. But really in a holistically privileged versus underprivileged group. That's basically what it is. A primary tenet of critical social justice is this. The question isn't, did something racist take place? It's how did it manifest in that situation? Which is to say racism is always already happening. Somehow this webinar is racist. Somehow. We just haven't figured it out yet. Why? Because we haven't found the right critical social justice proponents to come save us, you know, and acknowledge our victimhood and infantilize us properly. Let's talk about infantilization before we move on to our conversation here. I see students being infantilized. I see this in getting rid of due dates for assignments. We see it in not having any you know, repercussions for lateness or anything like that. We see it in the idea that one does not have to back up one's ideas with sound logic, with critical thinking, because as a, for example, Black person, we should just believe his lived experience, right? You know, other people can think critically. You can say whatever you want because you're Black, right? That is infantilizing. That is basically saying you don't have to do the things that make us the authorities we are, right? You don't have to think critically in academia because you've had it bad and you still have it bad, so we're going to take it easy on you, right? You can't possibly do things the way we do it. That's why we have things like equitable math, ethno-mathematics, math for Black people. You know, that's a thing. And what I was seeing in my field, rhetoric and composition, which is about really the written word, also the spoken word, but it emphasizes the written word. What we're seeing there is that we can't expect Black kids to master standardized English. There is one prominent Black scholar in my field who says it's virtually impossible for students who are speaking a Black vernacular to learn standard English. That is in writing. He published that sentence, right? That's where my field is right now. And that's the infantilization I'm talking about. And that infantilization, like the sacred victimhood, and like prefigurative politics, those things are necessary for critical social justice to live on in academia. You take those things away, it falls apart. So the book is basically about how critical social justice manifests in my field, in the classroom, amongst scholars, right? Amongst scholar activists as well. It talks about how activism has replaced scholarship, and that the people in my field are not rhetoricians doing activism, they're activists doing rhetoric, right? Which is a very, it sounds similar, but they're very different. The activism comes first, right? That's basically what the book is about. I didn't want to sit here and just go over, you know, chapter by chapter, a summary of the book. You get the gist of it from what I've talked about just now. So I think that's, how much time do I? Okay, almost my time. Where is that my time? 20 minutes or so?
Well, yeah, pretty close.
Okay, we can end now. Okay.
All right. Erec, let me start by saying I first encountered your work about 3 years ago, and it's a pleasure to finally get to meet you almost in person, virtually in person.
Pleasure is mine as
Now,
well.
good. Let me start by asking this. It's my own question, and I bet it's occurred to a lot of our listeners as well. How did you get into the academic world, and what is it like to teach at your college?
I got into the academic world. That's a long story, but I can tell you how I got into the field of rhetoric and composition. I was in a master's program for American literature, specifically the nonfiction stuff, and I took a class, Theories on the Sublime, and we read Longinus, whose work on the Sublime is also considered a canonical text in rhetorical theory. We read Nietzsche, who also is seen as somebody who is who discussed rhetoric, philology anyway, to a degree. I mean, you'll find Nietzsche in rhetoric anthologies, right? And I found interest in these things, and I talked to my professor about it, and he informed me that there was a whole program called Language, Literacy, and Rhetoric. Nobody told me about that. I had to inquire into it. So I received my master's and decided to get a PhD in language literacy and rhetoric, and that's how I got into the field of rhetoric and composition. So it was totally inadvertent. I happened upon this field. I didn't know it existed. I was happy when I realized it did. Of course, I didn't see what was coming in the future. But yeah, regarding York College is a small school, but it's also a predominantly working class environment in a very rural, red part of the state of Pennsylvania. These students have full-time jobs, many of them, right? They may still stay at home or live at home to save money. They don't have time for encampments, right? They don't have time for stuff like that. Just their lives are not conducive to that. There is a reason why the subfield that is responsible for studying protests and encampments and things like that is called leisure studies. There's a reason for that. You got to have a lot of time on your hands. Your college students do not. So you don't see as much of it there as you would on other campuses. That being said, I'm not there right now. I kind of took a step away for a while to work at the Cato Institute in DC. So I am not teaching at the moment. But in my experience at your college, which was about 11 years, right? That's what I experienced. There are people who have lives that just aren't conducive to, spending all day protesting about something, be it, something happening in your neighborhood or something happening 5,000 miles away, right? That's just not the reality at your college.
Erec, you're the founder and editor of the journal Free Black Thought.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us how that came to be, and tell us something about the kinds of writings that are found in your journal.
Well, as I was writing a critique of anti-racism in rhetoric and composition, I was looking for like-minded people, various social media platforms, webinars, things like that. And I wanted to do my best to speak at some of these webinars and give interviews and tell people what was going on in my field. and academia at large. And well, through all that, I met a few people, like-minded people, and we came up with the idea of Free Black Thought. Now, what's Free Black Thought? It is a nonprofit. It actually is a nonprofit, focused on viewpoint diversity within Black America, which is to say that essentialism is misguided, right? It's an erroneous way of looking at things. I feel hesitant to even say the term Black community, because that suggests some kind of essentialism throughout. But the point of Free Black Thought is to show people, let them hear or let them read voices and ideas they won't get from the mainstream media when it comes to Black writers. So the articles that we publish in the Journal of Free Black Thought are articles that probably wouldn't get published in other journals because they don't abide by a particular narrative. They don't abide by the prescribed behavior of a Black person, right? So we give those people a voice. We also have a podcast in which we give those people voices. And that podcast, it's pretty interesting. It has people with similar stories to mine. It has people who are on there just to talk about their niche, because not a lot of people know about their niche, something like that. Be they musicians or poets or activists themselves. Again, all these are voices that you wouldn't hear otherwise. All these are voices that are trying to be silenced by mainstream media because they don't fit the narrative, right? The narrative of victimhood, of us versus them. So that was the motivation for Free Black Thought.
One of the most intriguing stories you relate in the book is that of W.E.B. Du Bois when he was at Harvard, a student. I think that's a fascinating story. It is so enlightening, and perhaps you could relate it for all of our viewers.
Yes. So W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous Black scholar, went to Harvard. He was an undergrad and graduate student at Harvard. And this was the late 19th century. All right. A lot of the Black people you saw in America used to be slaves, right? Slavery had ended relatively recently. This is the 1880s, I believe, when Du Bois is going to college. But you wouldn't know it because he was quite confident in himself, and he had a healthy sense of agency and self-efficacy. He wanted something and he went to get it. He did not feel like a victim, and he was explicit about not feeling like a victim in his writings about this time in his life. And he said things like, I didn't, I wasn't arrogant when it came to other white people. I just wasn't obsequious. I wasn't bowing down to them. I wasn't, acting like I was inferior to them. Maybe they didn't like it, but I didn't care. This is what Du Bois was like in the 1800s. So somebody embracing victimhood now in 2024 should really know this story about Du Bois in the 1880s, going to Harvard as a Black man and being, not shaken at all by his experience. What's more, he took writing seriously. His first bad grade was in writing a composition class, right? And instead of saying, well, this is racist, or the teacher is racist, he said, you know what? I need to learn how to say things in certain ways if I'm going to get my point across to the people who need to hear it. All right. In other words, he was acting like a rhetorician. He had a pragmatic disposition. In fact, one of his professors was William James, and a mentor, a legit mentor to him, was pretty much the guy you associate with pragmatism in this country. He was a very pragmatic and very aware person. He was the kind of person who saw the world as it was and not how he wanted it to be. There was no prefiguration going on with Du Bois, right? There was no victimhood. Victimhood would get in the way of his pursuits, right? He articulates all of this better than I am right now. In an essay he wrote in the 1950s called The Negro Attends Harvard in the late 1800s or something like that. I'm blanking on the actual title, but I got the gist of it right there. And so I put this in the introduction of my book to say, hey, this is just, this embrace, this learned helplessness, this infantilization that has become not an aberration, but the norm in my field is wildly unnecessary, not just unnecessary, wildly so. Du Bois was Black in the 1800s, and he didn't feel like a victim. How can you justify your victimhood, right? So that's why I include that story, and that's why I include it in the very beginning to really set the tone for the book.
You have said that the diversity, equity, and inclusion ideology is built upon a foundation actually designed to perpetuate racism. How so?
Well, because it's undergirded by critical social justice, right? Which needs prescriptive racism to thrive. Prescriptive racism is another form of racism, right? Perhaps a traditional form of racism is, oh, that person's Black, he can't possibly be a physician, right? Prescriptive racism is, that guy's Black, he should be doing something else. He's not being Black correctly. The physician thing's for white people, right? Not doing something correctly, not abiding by the script that was given to you, right? That is prescriptive racism, and that is necessary in critical social justice, because each race, especially Black people, they have to play a particular role in this narrative. That role is the downtrodden, victimized person who is always owed something in every situation because they're always being oppressed in every situation, right? That is a form of racism. You're only allowed to be this. White people, you're only allowed to be, the oppressor. You're only allowed to be the person who's not allowed to talk, because that would be taking up space and colonizing the space and things like that, right? So because of your race, here are your lines in this story, right? Because of my race, I have lines. And if I don't abide by those lines, I'm probably stepping on somebody else's lines, probably a white person. So that is why, contemporary DEI, if it's undergirded by critical social justice, which is most of the time these days, right, actually perpetuates racism.
Suppose that we have one of those professors about whom you write in the book who declare that teaching standard English is oppressive and they don't do it. Well, then what do they teach? What is there what to do in a classroom if every student is entitled to his own language? Isn't it under pulling the rug out from underneath the whole academic enterprise?
Yes, to a large degree. And that is a really long answer. I'm going to try to say it as quickly as possible. But there is this idea that if you have students write however they want to write, they're still using rhetoric, if they're writing to a particular audience. So dialect is, not standard English, but some rhetorical practices are still there. So that's one way of justifying it. Another way is that, well, if the students don't want to write in their home dialects, they don't have to, right? They can do their best to learn to standardize English. That being said, the person who made that argument, that it's inherently racist to expect Black kids to write in standard English, thinks that if those students are given the opportunity to write in African American vernacular and they don't take it, they're being, quote, selfish and immature.
Ah,
This is on video. I'm not making this up, right? They are selfish and immature. Why are they selfish and immature? Because if they learn this very valuable skill that could help one be happy and fulfilled in one's adult life, then that will just maintain the status quo.
mhm.
And the status quo is the problem. So their learning of standard English is maintaining the status quo. And, apparently they must know that. And if they know that, then they're being selfish and immature, right? So yes, it's standard English is still there to be learned, right? But it's discouraged because it perpetuates the hegemonic forces, also known as white supremacy in these circles. It holds it up and maintains it. That's the short version.
Okay, good. Well, you've spoken about your experience with anti-racist professors who treat people like you as enemies simply because you question whether events actually are racist and question their whether their approach is actually empowering or disempowering. So let's discuss that a little bit. And what do you think that tells us about the state of academia, that we can't even talk about arguments such as those that you make?
Well, critical social justice is a very illiberal movement. And what I mean by that is it doesn't abide by the primacy of reason. It doesn't abide by the primacy of individuality, even free expression, really, if you have a certain position in society anyway. All these things, that's the way it is. It's against all those things because those are the very things that can prove how absurd and inadequate critical social justice is. So suddenly you have, in my field, experts in communication who refuse to communicate, right? Because communication is doing a couple of things. A is opening themselves up to scrutiny that will clearly show the irrationality of their ideas. And secondly, you're dignifying the other person with a response, right? If they ignore me, that's more powerful than trying to have a conversation with me, even if they somehow won the conversation, because my ideas were heard, right? They were heard. They're out there now. Some students or other faculty are mulling over those ideas, right? So if you're going to have one ideology that you're going to use to get rid of racism, or actually perpetuate it, but let's play their game here, to get rid of racism, then you can't tolerate the other ideologies. You have to exercise what Herbert Marcuse called repressive tolerance. We cannot tolerate anything that isn't this. We cannot tolerate anything that isn't critical social justice. That's how we take over, right? We make it so that the whole world, students, other faculty, administrators, people see the whole world through this critical social justice lens and no other lens. In fact, those other lenses are racist. And literally, that's those other lenses are racist. That's the line. Critical thinking is racist because that's how white people think. That's not how minorities think, right? The scientific method, that's how white people do things, right? I'm not making this up. I'm not exaggerating. This is you can Google this stuff right now. There's documents all over the place. Proudly, with writers proudly saying this stuff, right? Not hiding it. So there's that. So that's pretty much why things like critical inquiry are not tolerated in the place where critical inquiry should be tolerated the most, academia, right? Because it's just, it's too risky.
Let's turn to some of the questions from our audience. David Smith asks, he asks, Dr. Smith, I'm curious to know how much pushback you have received locally for your ideas at the institutions where you taught and now teach.
Well, I didn't get much pushback. There has been pushback at your college, coming mainly from administrators, but nothing too dangerous for me. A, I'm tenured, and B, I mean, I have enough of a platform that if something did happen, I'd just write about it and have everybody know about it the next day. Nobody wants to take that chance, right? So I'm okay. Plus, as I said earlier, your college isn't the encampment type of place. That being said, I haven't been there all semester, so I don't really know what's going on. But it hasn't been that kind of place. So I'm not getting much pushback there. The pushback comes from within the field, my field of rhetoric and composition. That's why the listserv I mentioned earlier is now defunct, because I wasn't backing down, and the vitriol that ensued prompted people to just shut the listserv down, right? Same thing with Facebook accounts of certain institutions in my field. They're gone now. So the pushback has come from my peers in the field and not on college campuses or the institutions at which I work. It's definitely not coming from Cato.
Here's a question from White Martindale, who asks if he could learn more about if there are any studies showing the results of students who are taught in the identity trap that you discuss versus traditional instruction.
Could you say that one more time? I didn't get the whole
Are
question.
there any studies focusing on the results of students who are taught in the identity trap that you discuss versus traditional instruction in English?
The first book that comes to mind is The Coddling of the American Mind. It's an essay in the Atlantic, so you can read the short version right now. But they go through the negative emotionality and the cognitive distortions that this kind of instruction creates, right? You're convincing students that they have no agency and that the world is structured to make sure they fail, right? Two things that are false, but also two things that are disempowering. You got into the world with that attitude, you're not going to be a very happy and successful person. And even if you are successful, you're not going to be very happy, right? And we're seeing this already among undergrads and things like that, as the book points out. There are several articles that are coming out lately. There's one I saw this morning that I look forward to reading, talking about how people who abide by critical social justice are pretty miserable people. They're depressed. They're very depressed people, and that's a recent study, right? So the studies about
people to be depressed as well.
What's that?
Apparently, they want other people to be depressed as well.
Yes. In fact, if you're not depressed, there's something wrong with you.
All right, here's a question from Rod Miller. He says, free Black thought sounds great. Thanks for taking it on. Can you talk about the level of contributions? That is, are lots of academics submitting lots of Black writers, white writers, Or is it tough finding folks who have something to contribute?
It is not tough at all. It's the easiest thing in the world. Everybody has something to say, and because of the prescriptive racism and the essentialism happening in various institutions, they don't really have a platform to say it, and we've given them that platform. We get academics, we get activists, we get high school teachers, we get musicians, we get all kinds of people wanting to talk about this, idea that Black people aren't a monolith, and here's how I'm going about my life. Here are my experiences, and things like that. We have a lot of Black Jews talking about the situation in Gaza right now, and you don't really hear from Black Jews in mainstream media, do you? We have a few in the journal and the podcast, giving their take on this whole thing, and it's very interesting.
Sounds like a vibrant
yeah,
journal.
yeah, I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of this journal. I had to, I had to step away from the editing stuff because I'm busy doing other things for Free Black Thought and other things. But what's happening with this journal and this podcast, it's something that puts a smile on my face every day, because more and more people are finding out about it. More and more people are, their eyes widen, metaphorically speaking, because they finally see a place where, the editors actually want that voice, right? And it's something I am very, very proud of. And I can speak for the rest of the co-founders when I say we are very proud of it.
Here's a question from Stan Young. Do you have any thoughts on implicit bias?
Yes, implicit bias training, implicit bias tests don't work. They simply don't work. And there's more than enough information explaining that. What's more is thought policing, isn't it?
Yes,
Right?
yes.
I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. And thought policing hasn't gone well in human history. Where you find that term, you find a lot of turmoil. So there's that. But let's talk about the test itself. Now, the same person, and this is actually, I was reading about this the other day, the same person can take that test 3 times in the same day and get vastly different results, right? They're really biased in the morning, but not so much in the afternoon. It's the same test, right? Or the same kind of test anyway. It doesn't work. What's more, it actually makes things worse, because now people are afraid. Oh wow, I'm implicitly biased. I'm not even conscious of it. I can't talk to the Black people. I'm going to say something bad. I'm going to say a microaggression.
Right.
I'm just going to not talk to them, right? So now you have a place that's more divisive, or divided anyway. Not divisive, more divided, because of the implicit bias test that was supposed to remedy divisiveness. So that's how I feel about implicit bias. I think it's a silly concept, and it does not work.
Next question. Thomas Grenis, a professor here in Raleigh, asked how much useful information would be lost if the federal government stopped classifying people by race?
Oh, that's a good question. How many well, it depends on what you're looking for, right? I think it's important still to do census, every few years, right? So every few years we do a large census to look at the demographics of America, see how people are living and why, things like that, kind of a snapshot. I don't think that's a necessarily bad idea, but the repercussions of not classifying people based on race moving forward, I I haven't really thought about that. Sheena Mason has a couple of books out on this, and they're pretty they're pretty profound. And I would check out her work. Camille Foster also has you know, this idea that we should just get rid of racial categorization, period. And now I like the idea. Don't get me wrong. I like that idea. I don't think we're there yet, right? There's a reason why the word Black is in Free Black Thought. You know, otherwise you wouldn't know what we are freeing. You know, so it's still there. It still needs to be freed from this essentialism. So in a sense, I need to use that term. So I want to see that world where race doesn't matter. Where race isn't a category, right? We don't focus on it so much, right? I would love to see that world. We're not there yet.
A question from Ramsey White. What are your thoughts on affinity groups? Can they work if there is a group for everyone? The only group offered for my daughter in middle school is the anti-racist white affinity group.
Yeah, I like the concept of free association, right? If you want to get together voluntarily and create an affinity group, even if it's based on a identity on race, that's fine. As long as you open it up to other people, right? You have your group does events on campus, and everybody can go to those events. Your group has meetings about certain topics relevant to, let's say, Black people, but everybody can come. You know, nobody's shamed for their race. Nobody's stopped at the door because they're the wrong race, right? If that's the case, if that's the dynamic, then I'm all for affinity groups. If they are exclusive and purposely so, then I have a bigger problem with that. What's more, if people are compelled to join them because of how they look. Oh, you're white. You need to go to the white caucus, you know, or whatever. I don't like that either. Because again, that's more prescription, isn't it? That's more essentialism. And that's exactly what I'm fighting against. So affinity groups done right, I'm all for.
A question from Deborah Wilson she asks, do you speak on campuses? And if so, how would one go about reaching out, and how would one present the idea to the institutional leadership?
Well, I do speak on campus. I can, or someone can share my information in a chat or something for everybody if they want to reach out to me. But the tricky part of that question is, how do you talk to administrators at particular institutions and convince them to have me on? That's a tough one. That's a tough one. A lot of people hear what I say and think I'm too controversial. I've been called, with a straight face, extreme right wing. I consider myself left of center. It's hard. It's easier when I'm part of a panel with other people there, so that, you know, I can be kind of outnumbered or something like that. But speaking on my own, which I've done several times this year, Swarthmore, Bridgewater State University, University of Utah, so far anyway. Speaking by myself is a different story. Yeah, that's going to be a tougher sell, but worth it, I think, right? Because things are changing a little bit. People are starting to see the toxic nature of a lot of these DEI initiatives, and maybe it is time for an alternative voice, you know, to be heard. So I think it's worth a shot, but regarding tactics for doing so, I don't have anything for you, and I'm a rhetorician.
Well, as you suggest, a panel discussion might be the way to go.
Yeah.
Well, we've reached 3:30, and unfortunately, that's the end of our time. It's been a lively discussion. Erec, thanks so much for being on with us. We really appreciate it. And
Thanks for having me.
we hope to have more of your writing in the near future.
You will. It's coming.
Good. Very good. Thank you so much to Erec Smith and to all of our participants. This is the end of the webinar.